All right, I think that's recording. Okay, guys, so today I want to talk to you about the price of plywood. This actually ended up being a cooler question than I initially thought. Um, when I started out with this question, what I initially looked at was I imagined that plywood producers, like most producers, would be price takers um, in the market, which means um, we as consumers have the ability to shop around, and so we tell them essentially what we're willing to pay for a product. And if they price it higher than that, we just go to somebody who's pricing it lower. It turns out that plywood and OSB, which is oriented strand board, which is actually more common than plywood, but these manufacturers are price setters, which means there is a lot of demand and a lot of supply, but the supply is all provided by a very small group of companies. So think of like OPEC in the oil industry, right? You have a small group of countries in that case that produce a ton of oil, and so they tell the whole world what the price of oil is going to be, and the world just has to deal with whatever they decide that price point is. So this ended up being a cool question. We're going to talk about just the price of plywood in general and OSB. We're going to talk about oligopolies, and we're going to talk about the prisoner's dilemma and the Nash equilibrium. Excuse me. Um, so let's start out just looking at a graph that I made here, um, just showing the price. And let me see if I can get it on the screen here. Just a second. All right. So there's a very, very cool site, and I'll bring that up first, and then we'll talk about the graph. So there's a cool site that is called FRED, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis puts on this economic data. So it's the Federal Reserve Economic Research website, but it's just FRED, fred.stlouisfed.org. You just Google FRED, and you're going to find it. And these guys track consumer prices for all kinds of goods. So, for example, here I'm looking at what I believe is the price per ton, and they've flattened the dollar. So they've taken care of inflation by saying we're going to pretend like the dollar is worth whatever it was worth in 1982 across the board. So it's not like normally you would say, okay, something was worth $20 in 1970, but that's the equivalent of $100 now. They flattened that line out. So a dollar in 1970 is worth the exact same as a dollar now, the exact same as a dollar in 1982. And they just arbitrarily chose 1982, and everything is balanced out to 1982. So this shows the consumer price index for pulp, so wood pulp, paper, and other products. And this one is particularly, specifically wood pulp. I thought this was interesting because oriented strand board was developed in the late 1970s. And you see right around it through the 1970s, the price of wood pulp suddenly jumps up and continues to go up. So that's FRED. If you ever want to look at price trends over time, type in the commodity you want to track and FRED in Google, and you're more than likely um, to get connected to the FRED site. Absolutely fantastic site for data. I use it quite a bit and really love it. So I pulled data from FRED. Now, the original question that was asked was, why is plywood more expensive than gold? I did put gold on this graph initially, but gold was so much more expensive that it made the rest of the graph unreadable. So, sorry, Marlon, plywood is not more expensive. Even if you're looking at per ton versus per ounce, it's still more expensive than plywood. However, you'll see here we have data going all the way back to 1947 on some of these. The price of lumber, they only started tracking quite a bit later in the 1980s. But you can see that it pretty well tracks, and everything kind of falls along the same line. So let's talk about why that is. My initial thought was, well, population started booming beginning in about the 1970s, 1980s, and there was a ton of building going on. So I pulled the data from the Census Bureau, from the census records for new builds, which is something that they kind of track. So new housing starts and new commercial buildings. I ran some data analysis on that and actually found a negative correlation. When more and more houses are being built in a given year, the price of plywood actually goes down a little bit, which was not what I expected. I expected the price to go up as demand exceeded supply. That's not what's happening. There is more than enough supply, enough so that when they actually flood the market and lower prices a little bit when there's a building boom. So that's when I started looking a little bit deeper. I said, why is it that this price has gone up and up and up pretty consistently? We're looking at plywood here. Other than during some economic downturns, you see it kind of go down, but also during some times when, right here, there's a giant building boom and it kind of dips down a little bit. And then it dips down in the recession and goes back up. So I started wondering why. And that is what brought me to this little article written here by the University of Massachusetts. Let me pull that over here. OSB prices and industry consolidation. And he basically says, look, all these guys that manufacture OSB, and he's specifically talking about OSB, but I found the same thing is pretty much true across the board. They're buying up all the smaller competitors. They're consolidating. And so you're starting to see where once there were many suppliers of OSB, that has now shrunk down. So in this case, the top 5 producers owned 38 of the 63 mills. You're thinking, okay, 5 producers own half of the mills. That's 56% of the market share. Okay, and he was at this time when this was written, he was saying, look, this is picking up. They're consolidating more and more. So I thought I would look into that and see where we are at now. This guy retired. I'm not sure when he wrote this article, but they have a disclaimer here that it's an older article. So I thought, okay, let's try and find some more recent information. So what I was able to find, excuse me, is this list here, thomasnet.com. Thomasnet is a really cool tool that shows you where things are manufactured. Their whole thing is to kind of do a little bit of marketing almost for these companies, and so they track, and companies give them data, and they track a lot of data on what companies are manufacturing stuff, where the big suppliers are, and that kind of thing. So what you'll see here is the top 3. So Boise Cascade in Boise, Idaho, Universal Forest Products in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Blue Links in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, this is for the U.S. These 3, 4.7 billion, 4.5 billion, 2.9 billion, nobody else even gets to $1 billion. In fact, if you add up all the rest of this list of 10, I think they maybe get close to the bottom of those top 3. So you've basically got 3 guys who are supplying probably over half, if not more, of the plywood in the nation. And from what I can tell, these same companies are doing OSB, or the Oriented Strand Board. So what does that mean? Well, that creates what's called an oligopoly. So I went on economicsonline.uk or .co.uk. They talk about what is an oligopoly. There's not really a defined definition, But what it basically means is that there are a few companies at the top that dominate the market to such an extent that no one else can change their prices unless those guys do. So if you think about, for example, a Texaco and a Chevron across the street from each other, they always have the same price. Why is that? Because Texaco is afraid that if they lower their price 30 cents, Chevron will lower its price 40 cents. They'll then have to lower, they'll then lower, they get into this price war, and then it's just like what we have between OPEC and Russia right now. That's an oligopoly, right? You have OPEC and Russia. Both of them historically have kind of agreed that they're just going to keep pricing at the same level, right? And then OPEC said, we're not. We're going to drop our price. And then Russia said, oh, yeah, well, we can drop it further. And then OPEC said, we can drop it so far that we'll pay people to take our gas. And you end up in this war where it's like, who's got the deepest pockets and can just take a loss for the longest amount of time. So in an oligopoly, in normal, industry, that doesn't really happen because there's so many players that just kind of gets drowned out. It just washes out, right? Consumers don't necessarily, have only two options. In plywood, in oil, you don't have a lot of options. So, for example, with plywood, there's probably 2 stores in my county that sell plywood, right? I could go to Lowe's, I could go to Home Depot. There might be a couple other, smaller shops that sell it. It's very likely that all of those stores that sell plywood in my area all get plywood from the same manufacturer. It's very likely. And so they get to set the price, and none of them can change the price without thinking about how the other guys are going to react. So they don't know if they should, if they're going to raise the price, they got to think about how that's going to affect everybody else. If they lower the price, they got to think about how that's going to affect everybody else because they don't want to end up in one of these wars, right? And that's what brings us to the prisoner's dilemma. Oligopolies all face the prisoner's dilemma. So what is the prisoner's dilemma? Well, I got this awesome thing for you. So the prisoner's dilemma is this. You have 2 guys, right? And they get arrested for a petty crime. They are facing a year each, okay? They're going to get 1 year of prison. The evidence is incontrovertible. They're going to get a year in prison, no matter what. But the investigator realizes there was bigger crime that happened, but he doesn't have the evidence. He needs a confession. So he comes to them and he says, look, prisoner A, he says this to each of them, right? Prisoner A, if you tell me what this bigger crime was and you rat out the other guy, you will get 0 years in prison and he will get 20 years in prison. If you talk and he talks, you'll both get 5. But if he talks and you don't talk, he'll get 0 and you'll get 20. The prisoners already know that if neither of them talks, they both get a year. So if I'm prisoner A, if I talk and the other guy doesn't talk, I'm out scotch-free. But he spends 20 years in prison, right? If neither of us talks, we both remain silent. We each get a year. But if I remain silent and he talks, I get 20 years and he gets out, with nothing. If we both talk, then we both get 5 years. What's my best option? I don't know what that guy's going to do, right? What happens most of the time when they play this game in behavioral economics is most people end up here, 5 years each, because they say, look, I'm not going to risk 20 years in prison, right? I'm not going to risk that, so I'm going to end up here, which is the worst case scenario for both people. The Nash equilibrium in this case would be right here, or as well as I understand Nash equilibrium, is the best case scenario for both people is for everyone to remain silent. But that rarely happens because we don't trust what the other guy's going to do when we can't see him, we can't talk to him, right? So in the US, collusion on prices is illegal, right? So we have a prisoner's dilemma. We have this oligopoly where we have three people who control a vast majority of the supply. They are price setters. They get to decide what the price is, and consumers either buy or don't at that price. So I drew a little prisoner's dilemma for our firms. I only did 2 firms here. Technically, in an oligopoly, you have to have more than 2. Otherwise, it's a duopoly, which has some different connotations. Let's just talk about 2 for the purposes of this. So we have firm A and firm B, right? They can either raise or lower their prices. Now, if firm A lowers their prices and firm B lowers their prices, they are going to sell more, right? Each one of them will sell more because more people will buy. They'll actually make overall 120% of what the current market is. They will each get 60% of the current market because they are going to create a bigger pie by lowering their prices. However, if firm A lowers its prices, but firm B raises its prices, firm A by lowering its prices, I'm sorry, I did this wrong. Oh, no. Yep, I did this exactly backwards. So, let's see. So if firm A, let me get my pencil out here. My bad, guys. So if firm B raises its prices, right, and firm A lowers its prices, then firm A gets 70% share of the market, where firm B will only get 30% of the market. Now, I'm just making these percentages up, but you can just for illustrative purposes. Because everyone's going to say, well, it's more expensive here. I'm going to go with firm A, right? And the same thing happens, and I've got it backwards again down here. This would be 30, and this one would be 70. Now, if everybody raises their prices, everybody stays even. Everybody gets 50% of the market, right? So what do? They actually do a suboptimal solution, and everybody raises their prices. So you end up with plywood that is more expensive than it should be. It's more expensive than the market would dictate, and it is more expensive than what would maximize profits for these firms. But they're going to do that because they don't know what the other guy's going to do, and they don't want to risk being in this situation where they're the guy that lowered prices to maximize profits, and the other guy didn't, and then you end up in this whole bad situation, right? And so what we end up with is a suboptimal solution with the oligopoly, where plywood becomes increasingly expensive because whenever somebody raises their prices, the other guy does too, because they don't. Nobody wants. Everyone just raises their prices and raises their prices, and you end up in this suboptimal solution. So that's an explanation. Hopefully that made sense about plywood, and some neat things about plywood, and why it is the way it is, why it's so expensive. What it boils down to is, and we'll go back to our little graph here. Now, one thing is plywood is fantastic. You need it to build. It doesn't warp. It doesn't shrink. It comes in standard sizes, standard widths. It is incredibly easy to build with, much more so than getting the same square footage of lumber, right? You're way better off. It is just much more efficient to build with plywood or OSB. So people are going to do that. And once they invented this in the 70s, the price of lumber went up, the price of pulp went up, because a ton of wood started being used for this purpose. And then we ended up, slowly through the 90s consolidating into an oligopoly, which then continued to raise prices at higher and higher rates, um, because that's what oligopolies do. They raise prices, either colluding explicitly or in most cases colluding implicitly, where nobody wants to be left behind, and nobody wants to lower prices and cause a price lowering war, right? Um, so there you have it. That is why plywood is so expensive. That is the prisoner's dilemma and oligopolies. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know I found out a lot more about plywood than I thought I was going to, and really enjoyed making this one. So I hope you guys learned something as well. We'll talk to you next time. Have a great day.